hope you're doing well and staying safe and staying healthy. The owls are over, which, like, what even happened to April? We're not going to talk about it. Everything is weird. Time doesn't exist anymore. Much like when I study for real exams, the owls went along a similar pattern for me, where I had a plan, as you saw maybe in my TBR video. But then when, in reality, we started out pretty slow and I ended up kind of changing my plans, and then we were kind of on a roll, but I really was like procrastinating what I needed to do with like other stuff I could do that was sort of productive, but like not really working toward the main goal. And then finally, right at the end, I like crammed hardcore to actually complete the thing I meant to complete in the first place. And I managed it at the last possible second. So just the whole thing is very on brand for me. My goal was to either complete the Culinary Sorcerer or Magizoologist requirements, and I did complete the Magizoologist requirements, including the Dragon Tamer add-on. And so I'm pretty pleased with that. I figured I'd go through really quick and tell you how it went, what I read, and sort of how my plans changed as I went along, because it did go a little bit differently than my TBR ended up originally being. So for Magizoologist, you had to complete Care of Magical Creatures, Charms, Herbology, and Potions. And then for Dragon Tamer, you had to just read a book that had something to do with dragons. And then I did have some books picked out for some of the other prompts if there was time. And so I'll go through those with you just in the order that I finished them. So first off, I actually didn't mean to have Parable of the Sower count for anything with my owls. But the thing is, this was picked out for me through Life's Library, which is a book club that John Green and Rosianna do together, and others. It does have a primarily white cover, so I figured it could count for Charms, but I didn't mean for it to. Like, I really just wanted to get through it because I was supposed to read it in January for that book club and just didn't get around to it. So I wanted to try and catch up, basically. I'd only read one other book by Octavia Butler before, which was Dawn, which is the first book in a series that I never continued. So I really wanted to read something else by her because she's a super important and famous sci-fi writer. The problem is that even though I really enjoyed this book and did give it a 4 out of 5 stars, it was just very topical. Like, this is like a near future sci-fi where like society is just starting to crumble. So it's like we're on our way to the post-apocalypse, right? We're in the middle of the apocalypse, basically. And I don't mean like an apocalyptic event. I just mean the like general crumbling of society. It's like this moment of transition. There's a lot of upheaval. There's a lot of uncertainty. It's like a lot. It's a lot to be reading during a pandemic. That was maybe not the best choice on my part. I really probably just should have read it in January. I think it would have been a little bit easier to get through than in this current moment. Regardless, I did end up getting through it eventually. It just took a long time, so instead of reading Nevernight for Charms, which was my original plan, I decided that this could also count for being a primarily white cover, and so I did end up just doing this for Charms instead. I definitely recommend reading this at some point if you're interested at all in sort of more classic sci-fi, I guess I would say, or just like this writing is amazing. Like, Octavia Butler is a great author, and so if you're looking for something else to check out by her that's like really powerful and still feels super relevant, even though she wrote this in what, like the 90s? I think this book is about as old as I am. It still feels like she could have written it yesterday and it would be just as topical. Yeah, 93. This book is basically as old as me. It's really, really great. Just maybe don't read it right now because it's a little bit too real, but 4 out of 5 stars overall. And then once I got through that, I needed something a little bit later, a little bit more comforting. And so I ended up detouring off of my, career path and just reading something else. And then I just kind of found a way to make it count, to be perfectly honest with you. And that book was a reread of Aristotle Dante, Discover the Secrets of the Universe, which is definitely a booktube darling. If you haven't read this by now, basically it's a really wonderful contemporary book, kind of slice of lifey, and it's about this boy named Aristotle and his friendship and then eventually blooming romance with his friend Dante, who like moves into town and they meet as children. And it's basically a little bit about their overall friendship, but it's also primarily about like a coming of age moment for Aristotle and Ari's relationship to his family. It's like a lot of stuff going on with him internally and like really wholesome family dynamics, and it's so wonderful. I actually didn't even own this before, like while I was reading it. What I actually did is I listened to the audiobook for the first time because I just started getting into audiobooks. I've been meaning to download Libby for years, and then when Ariel talked about it in a video, I don't know, somewhat in the last couple of months, time is an illusion, I don't know how long ago that was now, I finally was pushed over into finally downloading it. The first 2 audiobooks I listened to were amazing. They were Gemina and Obsidio. And then from there, when I looked up Aristotle and Dante just to see what the audiobook looked like, I realized that Lin-Manuel Miranda was the narrator, so I was even more excited. And so I was like, well, okay, I wanted to reread this anyway, but now I absolutely have to, and I have to do it in this way. So that was wonderful. It's still a 5 out of 5 star read for me. It was just so wonderful to have this very comforting, very wholesome, like I'm crying kind of a read. And it ended up very much re-energizing me and kind of getting me back into the rest of the readathon. After finishing that, I tried to sort of get back on track and go towards my actual requirements again. And by doing that, I thought that I was going to be reading the Mapmakers War for Herbology. This is actually a pretty short book, but it's really interesting because it's been a long time since I have read a book written in second person. This entire thing is essentially framed as like a translated old document of this like map maker from another time and another age. It's like literally just one page in the beginning to kind of give you a framing device. And then the whole story itself is the main character basically talking and reminiscing about her own story to herself. And so that's why everything is you did this and like you were thinking this. It went through like her whole life story. So that was really interesting. I enjoyed the story. It was definitely a little bit different than my typical fantasy that I read. Not only because of this framing being so different, but because the magical elements were sprinkled in there, but it was primarily like a character-driven story. And so there was sort of these fantastical elements that sort of drive bits and pieces of conflict, but it wasn't like a really, like there was not a magic system. However, there was mention of a dragon, and so once I realized that, and I wasn't sure if the dragon on the cover was meant to just be like a map-makery flourish, or actually there was going to be dragons. And so when it turned out there were dragons, or a dragon in the story, I finished it and decided to make it my dragon tamer requirement instead of my herbology requirements, because I had one other book that started with M, and so I figured I would use that one instead, and do this instead of Priory of the Orange Tree, because that book is pretty hefty, and it just didn't seem like I was going to have enough time to read through that one and the rest of my requirements. So I figured this was a good backup, and then if I had time to read Priory, then this could have been my Murmish Linguistics requirement instead, but it just ended up being my Dragon Tamer one, and so that ended up working out well. Trying to see what did I rate this? I'd given it a 3.5. It was enjoyable. It didn't blow me away, but it was interesting. It was a little bit of a slow pace for me, but yeah, overall I thought it was pretty good. It was fairly short, so that was great, and then it was time to move on to my next one. That ended up being my actual herbology requirement, and that was The Masked City, which is, I think, the second book. Yes, the second book in the like Invisible Library series. I think that's the name of the series. I had read the first book in this, again, about 5 years ago, because I read both Ari and Dante and the first book in this series while I studied abroad. It's been exactly 5 years since then, so it was really fun to sort of dive back in. These are connected, obviously, but they're a little bit almost serialized. Like, basically the premise is that there is this like interdimensional library, and the librarians that work in it are kind of like secret agents, and so they will go to different worlds and different realities and pull specific books for the library, and this often leads to crazy hijinks and all kinds of adventures. And so it's like each book seems to be like yet another one, like another chapter in Irene, our main character's adventures in this sort of world. This was fun, but I didn't end up like being as enthralled with this one as I remember loving the first book in this series. Part of the reason is I think the other sort of main character, Kai, was sort of out of commission during most of this book, and so while I still really enjoyed sort of the antics of this, it didn't compel me as much because I really liked their character dynamic in the first book. And yeah, overall it was fine. I had a good time. I would probably read the next one. There's quite a few books in this series, but it didn't like blow me away. Just a solid 3 out of 5 stars. It was good, and that was herbology, and then I was able to move on. After that, I decided to do my potions requirement, which was tricky. Originally, I thought that I was going to do one of the craft books that I bought in, like writing crafts. I was going to read one by Ursula K. Le Guin, and instead what I ended up doing is I found this book, Sequence, which I had gone into Boston with one of my best friends, Jess, and I keep forgetting what the actual event was, but it was a bookish event of some kind. And while we were wandering around outside, looking through some of the different booths and such, there's a few like smaller authors hanging around selling their own books, and so we stopped by and chatted with Kenneth Rogers, really nice dude. He had a few of his books there for you to buy, and so I actually got this signed by him at the time. This was a few years ago, but this was exactly 150 pages, so that worked out perfectly for that. This was interesting in a very weird way. Like, this was also a sci-fi book, but really it's like a sci-fi premise, and a deep character study of two characters. The sci-fi elements were there, but it was much more about the two characters than anything else. The biggest surprise for me with this book was just that I didn't realize how dark it was going to get, because we really go ham into these two characters' past traumas. So I actually put some trigger warnings in my Goodreads review. If you want to check those out, I will link to that in the description. So it's not like it was badly written or badly handled in any way. I just didn't know that I was getting into something this heavy. And so even though it was a short book, it was like pretty emotionally taxing. Essentially the premise is that there's this thing called Pandora. The world is kind of going to shit. There are these black clouds that keep causing bizarre climate and outages and all this stuff, and so scientists are trying to figure out like how to fix this. And in the event that they can't, they created this like sort of an AI type of thing called Pandora, but it's not like a robot that you talk to. It's like this huge database that can take memories and sort of figure out what humanity is by storing other people's experiences and then categorizing them. And so you find out like what exactly has been going on down here, and like all of these flashbacks as the book gets told. And yeah, it just like really goes into this character study, and it's just way darker than I thought. So I did end up giving it a 3 stars, but yeah, just like not the sort of light reading that I was really in the like I was really just not in the mood for anything heavy. And then that was yet another book that was like super dark. Yeah, a little bit traumatizing, but it's fine. At least it was a short book. The next thing I did was listen to The Bear and the Nightingale. So again, I did the audiobook for this, which was pretty decent. It wasn't my favorite audiobook, but the story itself was very fairy tale-esque, as you've probably heard before. This is following one girl and sort of her family, just the sort of their normal everyday lives, but then how like old and new practices in terms of like religion and beliefs are affecting their family and affecting their community. And there's a lot of like I said, like folklore and stuff involved. So this was a really interesting and really lovely read that's written absolutely beautifully, and just very much had that sort of fairy tale element that having it be told to me via audiobook just kind of felt right. Because a lot of the time when you're talking about folklore and like fairy tales, they're the kind of stories that you expect to be like told aloud and like passed on in an oral tradition sort of a way. So I did really enjoy this, and I think I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars. I should really be more prepared. Yeah, 4 out of 5 stars. It didn't give me the sense that like I had to move on to the next one. It was a pretty self-contained story, so that was good. But there are other books in the series, so maybe I'll eventually get around to those. This ended up counting for, oh my god, what requirement was it? Oh, you know what this was? I read this specifically because of the reading rush. I didn't actually read it in the weekend of the reading rush, but I picked it out for it because it had a house on the cover, and so I ended up getting around to it for that late, and I just like wanted to read it. So even though it wasn't going to count for anything, yeah, I don't think it did. Oh, you know what it ended up counting for? It ended up counting for Transfiguration. It didn't go towards my career, but I did manage to like make it count for something. After that was the most odd sort of experience for me. Ruby was the only book that I have that has any like beaks on it. As you can see, there's all these crows on the cover. That was the closest thing I could find to count for Care of Magical Creatures. I don't even know how to explain this book. It's definitely literary fiction. I don't want to say that in like a weird way, but like it's written beautifully, as you would expect. However, like the second half of the book, once again, just got like way darker than I realized it was going to get. There are sort of some, again, magical realism-esque elements to it. Basically, it's following these two characters. It starts in their childhood and then goes into the 60s in Liberty, Texas, but it's like there are 2 Liberties. There's like the White Liberty and the Black Liberty, and these two characters live in the Black Liberty. And one of them had moved to New York, had like left, and then came back, and now she's kind of crazy and sort of written off by the community. And the other main character, Ephraim, really wants to like help her out and is a little bit in love with her. And so it's their relationship and also their like community and just the whole sort of story of their town and their relationship. Like again, there's like spirits and sort of like there's a voodoo woman kind of a thing. All of that. There's like all these different ghosts and like supernatural elements that sort of come into play. It just, yeah, there's a lot of trauma that gets unpacked when it comes to Ruby. On the one hand, I am really glad that I read it, and on the other hand, I really wish that I never got the answers to all of the questions that the first half of the book sort of posed to me. So again, it's not that it wasn't well written, it was. It's just that the subject matter was a lot more traumatizing and disturbing than I really wanted to read about in this current moment. So I ended up giving it, I think, a 2.5 because like my overall enjoyment level was like way down by the time I finished this book because I just felt thoroughly disturbed. But on the other hand, like it was really well crafted And like Ephraim himself, one of the main characters, was like literally the one ray of hope in an otherwise horrific and just kind of awful setting, like awful community, like complicated community. It's like the people weren't terrible people, but it's complicated. It was a lot. It was dark. Yeah, it was just a weird reading experience for me. I wouldn't necessarily not recommend it. It just like wasn't what I wanted right now. And it was the only choice I had for Care of Magical Creatures, so I had to finish it. I actually had to put it down part way and took a break. And while I was taking that break, I ended up reading Again But Better, which is Christine's book. And like, I was a little bit nervous because, you know, when I watched all her writing vlogs leading up to the release of this, it sounded like something I was going to enjoy, which was a relief because I really wanted to support her, but like I wasn't just going to buy a book I wasn't going to like want to read. So I was glad that it sounded like something right up my alley, but I was still kind of nervous. I was like, what if I don't like it? But I loved it. I loved it. I actually listened to the audiobook for this one as well. Like I have it, but I just like wasn't in the mood to physically read it. So I had put Ruby down and decided to read this as my Muggle Studies requirement, and it was just, oof, there's a lot. Basically, if you don't know, this is about a girl named Shane, and she is a junior in college and about to embark on her study abroad experience in London. As someone who also studied abroad in her junior year, I figured this was going to be a little nostalgic for me, and it definitely was. Like, Christine captured sort of the feeling of what, like, a lot of what she was writing about for what Shane was going through obviously was not like a perfect mirror of what I went through, but the overall like tone and feel and just general like atmosphere of what Shane went through during her study abroad experience definitely rang like super true for my own experiences. And so it like really just like brought me back in a way that was like a little bit much sometimes. I was like, oh geez, like my heart kind of a thing. There were a lot of things that were like eerily similar in a way. I really was enjoying it, but it wasn't wowing me in the first half. I was like, oh, this is like really nostalgic, but it's not like the most amazing thing I've ever read. It's like a decent debut. But then there's something that happens right in the middle, and I literally like, I wrote my Goodreads review too. I like actually gasped because it occurred to me like a little bit before it was happening what I thought was actually going to happen, because there is a little bit, again, of like a magical element to this book as well, sort of like a fairy godmother type of thing. I knew that Christine had said that, but I had like forgotten, I guess. And so when I realized what I thought was about to happen, I was like, oh my god, is this really are we really going there? Are we really doing this? And then we did. And it was a little bit different too than what I thought was going to happen. And it just like blew my mind. I was like, oh my god, like we're actually, holy crap, this is a whole game changer now. And so really in the second half is where it really, really grabbed me. Like I flew through it. I couldn't like turn the audiobook off, and it just hit me in all of the feels. It is very Christine, and I mean that in the most loving way possible. Like if you know anything about anything that Christine likes, like Shane has a lot of interest in common with Christine. Like, okay, yes, we're talking about the mortal instruments in here. Things like that, where it was never distracting because it is very like 2011. A lot of the things that Shane is into and that sort of a thing, like that particular, being that age at that time, like what you would have loved, it wasn't just Christine. It was also just like of the decades that we're talking about here, or the time that we're talking about. But yeah, in the second half of the book, I stopped being able, it's kind of like with both, like when I read John Green or Hank Green's books, there are points where I'm like, oh yes, this is John talking to me, or this is Hank talking to me. Like they'll pop out of the book. This happened with Christine as well. But when I got into the second half, that kind of disappeared for me. I stopped remembering that it was Christine's book, and it was just like a regular, anybody could have written this book, and I'm just in it, and I'm just like super invested in these characters. So yeah, it's a long rambly way for me to say that I really loved this book. I cried, like I was super emotional. It made me want to reread all of my own study abroad journals, and like made me want to reach out to my study abroad friends. And yeah, it was really great. And I'm really glad that I listened to it, even though reading this basically made it so that I almost did not finish Ruby in time to finish the readathon, but I did. So overall, I ended up reading 7 requirements plus the Dragon Tamer add-on. So I think that was pretty good. 7 out of 12 plus an 8th book for that extra requirement. I think it's pretty great. I'm hoping I'll be able to continue on with NEWTs, and I hope that you guys' readathon went really well. I think overall I enjoyed most of the books that I got through in this readathon, and really enjoyed listening to all these audiobooks, so went really well for me. Hope it went well for you. Let me know what your career was that you were working towards down in the comments. If there were any big surprises for you, what your favorite book was from it, what your least favorite was. I think that's pretty much it for me. I've rambled on long enough about this. Now it is May, so I will be trying to do the Asian readathon and tome Topple, and just in general trying to get through a lot of other audiobooks that I'm now obsessed with getting from Libby. I will check in with you about that some other time. Yeah, hope you're all staying safe and healthy, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.